get started. Now it is my job to talk about infarctions. Yes, an infarction is another term for blockage, right? Yeah, so first we're going to talk about an infarction of the heart, indeed. And that type of infarction is called myocardial infarction. In other words, it's a heart attack. It's a heart blockage. And if you look at the screen to the left, you can see in an artery right here, there is a blockage, and that caused an infarction. And when an infarction occurs, in this case, red thrombus on a ruptured arteriosclerotic plaque caused a blood flow blockage. And when there's blockage, that site right here, if you look and you can see my little cursor of tissue can die. That muscle can die. And when it dies, it doesn't often repair itself. So it's often permanent. So myocardial infarctions are very serious because it's an infarction or blockage of your most vital organ. So let's get into the business of understanding the differences between some types of infarction. And the two most common types are referred to as an NSTEMI and a STEMI. So on the right, you see a STEMI. I want to draw your attention here. A STEMI is the acronym for ST elevation myocardial infarction. So that means that I'm going to tell you what it means in a minute, but it's describing at the bottom, you see the waves on the EKG, and it's describing where the infarction is. And it's also not necessarily where the infarction is, but it's describing the type of infarction. All right. So these letters have meaning. You can't see it, but there is a wave called a P wave, and that represents the electrical activity of the atrium, the upper chambers of the heart. And the Q, the R, and the excuse me, they refer to this as a complex, and it represents the electrical activity of the ventricles, the lower chambers of the heart. And I'm going to tell you, that's the lower chambers are most significant, and they're most when it comes to these acute myocardial infarctions. And then you have a T wave over here. This represents the electrical activities of the ventricles as they relax. And then you have a U wave, which isn't present, and it's a small wave that sometimes follows a T wave. Sometimes, right? So when it sometimes follows that T wave, sometimes it's not apparent, as in our case, you don't see it. And the purpose of it is unknown. People just don't know what that U wave means, so I'm not going to elaborate anymore. However, it's this ST segment right here that's important. And it's the segment of this EKG or ECG, and this represents the period of time when the ventricles are recharging right here. And when this ST segment is elevated, So how do you know it's elevated, Mrs. J? Well, this blue line represents your baseline, and it's not sitting on or near the blue line, so it is elevated. And when it's elevated, you are likely to be having an ST elevation myocardial infarction, right? So you're more than likely having a heart attack. Now, an NSTEMI is a non-ST elevation infarction. So it's an infarction too, but it's not a STEMI. In fact, the difference between the two, that ST segment is not elevated, it's depressed. You see, this is the baseline here. And as you can see, here's the ST segment. It's down, it's lower. It's even below the base here. It's not as high as this one. This one's way up here, okay? But that ST segment is depressed. It's lower or underneath the baseline. And so what is the difference between the two? Well, definitely one is more severe than the other, definitely. And the STEMI is more severe because an NSTEMI is caused by a block in a minor artery versus the STEMI, which is a block in a major artery. Now, just by virtue of the major versus minor, that tells you the severity of the two. Now, the STEMI can also have partial obstruction in a major, the NSTEMI can also have a partial obstruction in a major artery, but it's not total obstruction. All right. Okay. So a STEMI is more complex than an NSTEMI, but they both can be of the same type. And we're going to discuss that a little later. But the next thing that we need to turn our attention to is the location of the infarction. And that's important. And the reason is because we have to code the location of the infarction, right? So all AMIs, acute myocardial infarctions, are coded according to the location of the infarction or the blockage of the artery. And when you code it that specifically, it's going to be reported with the fourth and the fifth character. Now, when that site is not specified, if the type and the site are not of the infarction are not specified, you're going to use code I21.9. When I say type, if it's not specified as a STEMI or a non-STEMI, and the site where in the artery is the infarction. And on the left, you see a picture of an infarction. And I'm going to guess this is the left anterior descending artery. How do you know, Mrs. J? Well, there's only five major arteries, five major coronary arteries, and the left anterior descending artery often sits there. And you're going to learn where these arteries are when you get to part 3. So I've been to part 3 and I know where it is, and you will too. So when they don't specify the type of infarction or if it's STEMI or NSTEMI or the site of the infarction, you're going to use code I21.9. All right. So I21.3 is unspecified site, I21.9 unspecified type and site. Woo. All right. So Mrs. J, what do you mean about types? What do you mean? How do we know how to determine the type of infarction it is? Well, there are two main types, and then you have type 3, 4, and 5. All right, your type 1 are your STEMI or your non-STEMI. All right, so that's the ST segment being elevated or depressed. Type 2 are myocardial infarctions due to demand ischemia, coronary artery spasms, anemia, embolism, and myocardial infarctions secondary to ischemic balance. So these can be infarctions that are related to not necessarily blockage in the heart, but in circumstances that cause the infarction, like someone running a marathon and they just all of a sudden have an infarction, but the reason for the infarction can be various. Type 3, these are other myocardial infarctions associated with revascularization procedures, or MI, due to sudden cardiac death when no biomarkers are found. Now, revascular procedures are when they do percutaneous coronary intervention while they're in there doing the intervention. That's a type 3. Also, type 4, these are also related to, well, revascularization is a form of percutaneous coronary intervention, but revascularization is a lot more in depth. They are rewiring. You could have a type 4, A, B, or C, and A is related to a percutaneous coronary intervention. And you're saying, what are you talking about, Mrs. J? Well, these are procedures, and trust me when I tell you, when you get to part 3, you're going to look at these procedures and they won't seem so foreign, but I do need to mention them. Type 4B is a myocardial infarction related to stent thrombosis. We'll address that in part 3. And also, 4C is a myocardial infarction related to restenosis. And 5, this is related to CABG. Again, these are procedures, and we'll talk about them in part 3. Now, let's talk about the duration of a myocardial infarction, the length of time of an infarction. Well, an infarction is considered initial or acute if the infarction, okay, let's just put it this way. If a person has an initial infarction, an initial acute infarction, and then they have another one, as long as the first infarction took place within a period of 4 weeks, specifically not more than 28 days. So 28 days or less. Why is that important? That's important because you will be coding for subsequent infarctions. And a subsequent infarction, if it occurs beyond 28 days, well, subsequent infarction is an infarction that occurs after the first one. So you've got your initial infarction, you have a subsequent infarction that occurs after. And why is this important? Because you need to know when these infarctions occur, right? Because people who have one heart attack are susceptible to have another one if they don't take the necessary precautions. So you're going to find that you're going to be coding for more than one infarction. So the first one is straightforward. You just code according to the documentation. The second one, you need to know when the first one occurred in relation to that second one, that subsequent one. And if it's beyond 28 days, we call that an old myocardial infarction. So it's just important that you know what an acute infarction is, what a subsequent infarction is, and what an old infarction is. Now, I've done a lot of fiddling around here, and I want to make sure that you're with me. I cannot see my chat. I'm going to take a moment to do that. So if you will, type in the chat, let me know, are you with me? Good deal. There's I'm with you. I'm following you. Outstanding. All right, so let's talk about how to code a type 1 AMI. And if you have your MCG manual, this is in your manual. Now, I want you to remember that RFE means reason for the encounter. And I want you to always be conscious of the reason that patient is coming in, right? Why are they there? What is being treated? Why did the patient come? Well, we have a patient that's admitted for an acute myocardial infarction. So the patient came through the door because he's having chest pain, and they've determined that this patient has an acute myocardial infarction. So as a coder, you need to know, did this patient ever have a heart attack before? If no, you are going to sequence, or you're just going to code out I-1. That's it. Unless they have other conditions not related to that infarction, you'll code them too. Let's say he broke his foot. You're going to code the broken foot too. But we're only talking about what we know. He only has an AMI. There's no other previous infarction. We're going to code I-1.1. Also, we need to know if he had another infarction. If he did, we'll be going over in this column. And if it is not older than 21 days, we're going to sequence first I-2.2. This is the recurring code. And the second will be their initial or their first acute infarction. Remember, the reason for the encounter is always significant, right? So why did he walk in? He's walking in, we're coding here, for recurring infarction. All right. Another thing, if it's older than 28 days, the old infarction, the other infarction, if it occurred more than 28 days and he's here for a recurring, you're going to sequence first I-2.1, second I-2.5.2. All right. So now we have another circumstance. And also, too, you can find your chart somewhere around page 61 in your MCG manual. Somewhere. No, I don't know if it's 61. If anyone knows the location, let me know. Type it in the chat, please. All right, so now we got to think about why the patient came, right? All right, so here's our scenario. This patient's admitted to a condition other than an acute myocardial infarction. But while he was in the hospital, he had an acute myocardial infarction, right? Yeah. So we always have to think about what is the reason for the encounter. We tend to get caught up in, oh, we're going to code the most severe. No, you're going to code the reason for the encounter. Why did he come, right? And then the one he's chiefly being treated for. And he might be chiefly treated for that infarction, but in this case, our documentation doesn't tell us. So we are going to have to code the reason for the infarction first. The reason for the encounter first, right? And then second, we're going to code that STEMI or non-STEMI, whichever it is. And again, if it's not old, if the patient had a previous AMI, you're going to have to code that too and sequence it as follows. The RFE first, your recurring infarction, and third, the acute, the first one, okay? And if it's older than 28 days, you're going to sequence the RFE, and then second, you're going to sequence I25.2 if it's older. All right? Now, it's time for us to test our knowledge. So we've got some exercises for you. A patient was brought into the ER with complaints of chest pain. The EKG showed an acute posterolateral myocardial infarction. All right, there are no multiple choice, but your time begins now. You have 2.5 minutes to solve. All right, how are you doing? How'd you do? Let's see what you did. I can't. Oh my goodness, those that answered are rocking. If you don't know where to start, it's okay. Just take a moment, breathe, and look up. I'll show you. This will be a great teachable moment for me. All right, good job. I see a lot of people with correct bosses. Good job. All right, so what do we do first? We're going to highlight our key terms, right? Our key terms are chest pain, acute, posterolateral, myocardial infarction. All right. And if you noticed, I said infarction a whole lot at the beginning, and that's on purpose because this is what we're coding for. And that's where you go in the index. You go to the term infarction, and then right underneath, you have a subterm myocardio. Myocardio. Then we're going down. Yeah, there's more. We always look to see if there's more to the story. And if you go down, you'll see that postural Infarction is here. And if you look over in the parentheses, you'll see postural basal, postural lateral, postural septal. So we can use this code I21.29. That's our code. Let's go verify it. In the tabular list, let's just start at I21.2 subcategory just to read it. This is STEMI, myocardial infarction of other sites. And then let's go down to I21.29. This is STEMI myocardial infarction involving other sites, but specifically, if you look below, posterolateral transmural Q wave infarction acute. There you go. And ladies and gentlemen, let's go back. Our answer is I21.29. All right, so I just kind of want to see if you, before I move on, how are you doing? You have an aha moment? Yes, we got to look these up in the index. Eventually you'll get to selecting the multiple choice answer, but I want you to know how to look it up in the index. All right, good job, good job. I see you're all doing good, outstanding. All right, next we have another. Come on. A patient was admitted with an acute myocardial infarction, and 10 days later, he's admitted for an acute anterolateral infarction. All right, you have 3 minutes to solve. Your time begins now. All right, time's up. How did you do? Let me just take a quick look. And whoa, outstanding. I see a few answers, and you are rocking. Even if you don't know, you can give a good guess. And I'm going to tell you, the good guesses are good. Remember, this is a multiple choice exam, right? Yeah. So if you can look at your little chart and kind of know some things, that'll be very helpful. So if you didn't get it correct, it's okay. You're going to have a teachable moment. So now I have to highlight my key terms. The patient was admitted with an acute myocardial infarction. 10 days later, he's admitted for an acute anterolateral infarction. So he had two infarctions within a period of 10 days. And we want to know, which side are we going to code? Of course, the right side, because he had a previous infarction. We're going to say yes. Now, below, we need to know if it was older, if the previous infarction was older than 28 days or not. And no, it was 10 days ago. So we are going to sequence in the following way. Our answer should look like that. I22 first, followed by I21. Yeah, so we know we're going to have two codes. All right, so just keep that in mind. Now let's go ahead and look up our terms. Let's look up the RFE first. And the reason for the encounter is the acute anterolateral infarction. So we're going to go to infarction and make sure myocardium is underneath it. And then we're going down. Myocardium is our subterm. Then we're continuing down until we find subsequent, subsequent or recurring in reinfarction, right? But we're not going to stop there. We're going to look for the location of the infarction, which is anterior, anterior wall, specifically anterior lateral. And underneath it, I22.0. That's our code. Now let's go look and verify at the tabular list. I22 categories for subsequent STEMIs. And remember, I just want to tell you the RFE, the reason that patient came, the reason the patient's admitted is for that subsequent infarction, right? Yeah, I22. And if you look down, I22.0, this is subsequent infarction of the anterior wall, specifically subsequent anterolateral wall, transmural Q wave infarction acute. So we know the first code is I22.0. Now let's go ahead and let's code for the second. Now, if you notice on our little chart, it's only giving you the categories or subcategories that you should be coding. So there may be more characters. So we're going to go to infarction. See at the top, it's infarction, but immediately underneath is cerebral. We're not talking about strokes. That's coming. So infarction, we're going to scroll down until we find myocardium, right? This is an acute infarction. Why is it acute? Why is the previous infarction acute? It's still acute because it's within the acute phase. It's only 10 days old, so it's still an acute infarction. However, that is not why we're here. That's not the reason for the encounter, so we will sequence it second. Now, this acute infarction, we're going to code I21.9 because this is the code for non-specific type, non-specific location of the infarction. I21.9. Acute myocardial infarction, unspecified. And our answer, final answer, I2 2.0, and I2 1.9 in that order. How you doing? Everybody, how you feeling? You feeling okay? Even if you got it wrong, don't be upset with yourself. You're learning, okay? You're learning. As long if you learn something, just say I'm doing great, right? Because if you learning it, that means you learned it. That you have a high probability of it sticking. Okay. Somebody said it's kind of shaky. It's okay. But if you learn something, that is fantastic. All right, good deal. Someone said they copied it to their ICD-10-CM. Outstanding. And I hope you're tapping those books, looking at those tapping lectures, and tapping away. All right. The patient is being seen for a new infarction. A, I2 2.8, I2 1.09, B, I2 1.11, I2 2.0, C, I2 2.0, D, I2 2.0, I2 1.11. 2 days. 2 days after being admitted for an acute myocardial infarction of the right coronary artery, a patient suffers a new anteroapical myocardial infarction. All right, so that patient, remember, is being seen for the new infarction. Your time begins now. You have 2.5 minutes. All right. I think I stopped the clock, but I think we're ready. So please disregard. Okay, so what we have to do is highlight our key terms. And of course, we're going to refer to our AMI chart. 2 days ago, this patient had an acute myocardial infarction of the right coronary artery. That's important. But today, the patient's here for that new anteroapical myocardial infarction, right? And we always have to remember, what is the RFE? Always tell yourself, what is the RFE? And the RFE is always going to be the new infarction. But right now, let's turn our attention to this chart. All right. So we know that this is a case where there was a previous AMI, and we have to first rule out some things. Was the previous AMI older than 28 days? No, it wasn't. It was 2 days ago. So we're not even going to consider that. However, it was within the 28 days, and therefore we're going to code it the following way. We're going to code I22 first, followed by I21. And if you look at I'm going to go back. B was coding I21 first, followed by I22. So B is wrong. We have to code the recurrent infarction first because it is the RFE. So B, you got to go. C also has to go. It's got to go because it's not even coding for the previous infarction. Got to go. So that leaves us with A and D. So let's go ahead. Since this is a multiple choice situation, we can go right to the tabular list and we're going to look up I22.0 and I22.8. I22.0 at D is coding for the subsequent anteroapical infarction. I like it. I do. And I211 at D, I211 is the ST or the STEMI for the right coronary artery. I like that too because the previous one was a STEMI of the right coronary artery. So I like it. I like this I22. It's a subsequent. I like it. And the second one is the acute. I know, I know. Some of you like, what? But always think about what they are treating. What is the RFE? Now, I21.0, this is STEMI involving other coronary artery of antero wall. And it even says that this is coding for anterolateral. No, anteroapical, right up underneath it. And it's acute. But you could use this code if you were coding for that and that were the reason for the encounter. But in our case, it isn't. All right. Excuse me, it is, we are coding for the recurring anteroapical, not the acute one, not the first one. So that's why I21.09 is incorrect. And it's also sequenced wrong too. All right. So they are sequencing it wrong. This is coding for the anterolateral first, like that's the one that happened first, and the right coronary was second. But in our case, we are here today to code for the anterolateral, the recurring one. And I know I have to watch how I say it. So if I'm confusing you, please forgive me. But recurring Secondary, sequencing first, second, just stay focused on the reason for the encounter. If the reason for the encounter is the secondary, you code the secondary first. All right. You all still with me? You guys rocked it. A lot of people got it good. You did. And that was kind of tough because we're using first and second and if you still got it good and if you need to listen again, go ahead and do that. All right, this is the last one involving acute myocardial infarctions. All right, well, not really. It's not an infarction. All right, so Melanie returns to her cardiologist's office for treatment of her chronic combined heart failure. So this is heart failure. A, I50.22, I50.32, B, I50.23, I50.33, C, I50.42, I50.43. All right, your time begins now. How did you do? Okay, now I'm checking because I can't see while you're answering. And it looks like, we got a little bit of the alphabet, just a little. Most of you said, let's go, wait, I have to scroll down just a little more. All right, we say C and D's. Yeah, C and D, C, 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 more C's. All right, let's see. First things first, let's go ahead and highlight our key terms. The key term is chronic combined heart failure. Yes, and the answer is C. All right, how do we get to this answer? Well, let's go ahead and look up the codes. It's just a matter of that and reading forensically. All right, so if we look at I50.2, this subcategory is wrong It's wrong because it's coding for systolic congestive heart failure. You might say, Mrs. J, isn't combined heart failure systolic, both systolic and diastolic? Absolutely, it is. Absolutely. But I'm going to tell you why coding both of them individually, both systolic and diastolic, wrong, because you have a code, I50.4, which is combined. And if you read further, it says systolic and diastolic congestive heart failure. So you've got a combo code, and your guidelines tell you that when you have a combo code, you code it. All right. So this category, subcategory I50.4, then you go down, you can code more specifically for chronic combined systolic and diastolic heart failure. So A is incorrect, B is incorrect, and C is incorrect because this is not acute on chronic combined. If it is, the documentation would have said that. Nothing in the documentation specified it. It only said it was chronic combined. So if you said C, outstanding. If you said D, aha moment for you, and that is priceless. All right, good job, everyone. Now we have to turn our attention to another type of infarction. And earlier we said an infarction is blockage, but this type of blockage, a cerebral infarction, is blockage of a cerebral artery, right? Now, there are two types of, and these are strokes. It's another word for stroke. And there are two types of stroke. You have an ischemic stroke and a hemorrhagic stroke. Now, the ischemic infarction occurs when the blood supply to a part of the body is blocked and it prevents oxygen and nutrients from reaching the tissue. Now, on the other hand, hemorrhagic, that type of infarction occurs when a blood vessel in the body ruptures. Specifically, when I'm talking about body, I'm talking about in the brain, right? So if a blood vessel ruptures, you're going to have bleeding in the brain, which can cause more damage than the blockage of blood flow, which is the case of hemorrhagic stroke. All right. So hemorrhagic is a little more, not a little more, a lot more complex and severe. Now let's get to the business of coding for these strokes. All right, so here's a guideline C9D1, sequela of cerebral vascular disease. This is important because often when a person has a stroke, they have some residual or late effects, right? So just so you know, I clipped this right from your MCG manual. If a patient has late effects of a stroke, let's say they are being seen for those late effects, you're going to sequence your late effects first, followed by the stroke if it's documented. If it's documented, keyword, if the reason for the encounter is the late effects, in the setting of a stroke, that's how you're going to sequence it. I69 first, and second, I60 through I67 if it's documented. And that's key because typically, if you're coming into the emergency room for that stroke, you might be coding for that stroke first, then the residual effects if they're present. But you have to pay attention to the RFE. Another thing you need to pay attention to is dominant and non-dominant. Now, there's a big change. There's a change in determining dominancy. Specifically, there's a change in your MCG, so I want you to pay attention to it. It says ambidextrous patients. All right. So before I get to that, dominancy means this is where the stroke happened, right? So if the stroke is affecting your left side, then that is what they're referring to. They're referring to where the stroke is affecting or has affected. Sometimes when you have a stroke, specifically a hemorrhagic stroke or a hemorrhagic stroke, you could suffer from hemiplegia. On the left, hemiplegia, hemiparesis, or monoplegia. So these are types of late effects that can occur. So you can probably have some paralysis on left side or right side. You could have, that's specifically what I'm talking about. Any kind of late effect affecting a specific side of the body, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about dominancy and side of the body. So if you are right-handed and your right side is affected, then your right side is your dominant side. If you are right-handed and your left side is affected, then your left side is your non-dominancy. All right? But if you are ambidextrous, then the default is the side that is affected, because remember, you are ambidextrous. So if it's your right side or your left side, it doesn't matter. The side that's affected is your dominant side. I'm gonna let that marinate. All right, so if you're left-handed and your left side is affected, then that is your dominant side. If you are right-handed, your right side is affected, that is your dominant side. However, if the opposite side is affected from your writing hand, then that's your non-dominant side. But if you're ambidextrous, that means you can write with your both your right hand and your left hand, then whatever side is affected by the stroke is your dominant side. All right, so erase in your MCG that right side, okay? And just the default is the side affected. All right, so I want to clarify that. Are you all with me? Go ahead, type in the chat. Let me see. Okay, good deal. Now, is there anything else? I don't think there's anything else we need to talk about. We're ready to rock and code. Yeah, let's get coding. Oh, and as Miss Carla would say, let's get it, let's code. All right, now we have some exercises. After suffering a cerebral infarction, a patient continues to have right-sided hemiplegia that is diagnosed as a late effect. All right, your time. Oh, let me read your answers. A, I69.351, I63.9, B, I69.353, C, I63.9, I69.351, and D, I69.34. Remember, choose the best code, best answer that describes the scenario. Your time begins now. All right. I don't think my timer went off. I don't think so. How you doing? Go ahead, type in the chat. You all are so sharp. Yeah, my timer didn't go up. All right, so let's go ahead and do our due diligence. I do apologize for that if my time is off. If I gave you less time, I can't even see you in the chat. All right, so here's the deal. We are going to have to employ some guidelines, right? Yeah. What happened here? Well, this patient suffered a cerebral infarction, and the patient continues to have this right-sided hemiplegia that's diagnosed as a late effect. So we're going to make an assumption. The assumption is that the attention is directed at the hemiplegia because that's what they're really talking about. They're saying they continue to have this. Now, often when people have an infarction, they usually get that in control, and then they will start noticing the late effects. So I'm going to go ahead. We have to code for the sequela. So when you have the late effect or the sequela in the setting of an infarction, we're directed to code it as, we're going to code first I69 from the I69 category, the next from I60 through I67 category. So we know we're going to code both if they're in the same setting. So let's take a look. So I think we can eliminate some things. Yeah, we have to code for the late effect, definitely. So we're going to get rid of C because C is not coding for the late effect first. Late effect is coded with I69. It's sequencing the initial infarction first. So we're going to get rid of C. We're also, oh, we can also get rid of something else, can we? Oh, no, we can't. So everything left is coding for the late effect. So yeah, I think we can eliminate something else. Yeah. Let's see what else we can eliminate. All right, so let's go ahead and look up these codes. All right, so I69.34, this is the subcategory for monoplegia. In our scenario, our patient has hemiplegia. So I69.35, that's coding for hemiplegia and hemiparesis is what we're going to use, this subcategory. So we're going to eliminate I69.341 category. All right. So yeah, we can eliminate something on site. And if you look at I69.351 and 353, one is coding for dominant side and non-dominant side. We don't know what handed this person is. Thank goodness this is a multiple choice scenario because we don't know which side they are, but they do have dominancy and they do have some condition, some late effect, and we do have to code it. And our job is to code the best answer of the four, and the best of the four is A, because A is sequencing your late effect first and sequencing your acute cerebral infarction second. Now that's rare. That's rare. I think that you're going to see that, but you will see it. So you need to know how to code it. All right. Let me go see if I can find you. I cannot find my chat. I can't find you. So please, I hope you're doing well. I don't like knowing that you're not. All right, we're going to the final scenario. Is it the final? Maybe not. It is. Yes. What is or are the correct ICD-10-CM codes for this encounter? A, I63.429, I69.321, Z86.73, B, I63.9, C, I63.9, I69.321, and D, I63.321, I63.9. A 56-year-old male was admitted today for CVA, cerebral vascular accident, that is an infarction. He has dysphagia as a result of a previous CVA 2 years ago. What is or are the correct ICD-10-CM codes for this encounter? All right, your time begins now. There you go. There's the timer. All righty. Let's get started. Our keywords. We have a 56-year-old admitted today for CVA. That is pertinent. Remember, the RFE is key for all infarctions. You need to know why they're there. That's going to eliminate a lot of stuff, and that's going to really help you. And this patient has dysphagia from a previous CVA. And if you're wondering, should I code that? If it's pertinent, you should code anything pertinent. And I think if they had a previous infarction and they had dysphagia today as a result of that infarction, and today they have a new infarction, you better believe it's pertinent. So, yes, you will code it. All right. Now, our keywords are now in green. We're going to get to the business of looking up the codes. I63.4 subcategory, specifically I63.429 is coding for cerebral infarction due to embolism of unspecified anterior cerebral artery. Wait a minute, there's no mention of an embolism. We don't know how or what caused the infarction. So A is coding for that, and it's going to be wrong. Also, Z86.73 is also wrong because it's coding for a personal history of transient ischemic attack. TIA, and infarction without residual effects. You know what? This person does not have a history of an infarction without residual effects, so Z86.73 is also incorrect. Gotta go. It's a distraction. And B, well, no, I63.9, this is coding for cerebral infarction. And that is indeed what happened. However, B is not right because it's not coding for the dysphagia. So we're going to get rid of B. And remember, we have C and D left. We need to stay focused and we need to code for the RFE. And the RFE is CVA, cerebral vascular accident. That's all. That's all we know. And that's what we have to code for. So I69.321, this is the dysphagia following a CVA. Well, even though this dysphagia is not related to this CVA, we still have to code it. And this dysphagia is not the RFE. It is not the reason for the encounter, so it should not be sequenced first. It is a correct code, but should not be sequenced first. And D is incorrect. And that leaves us with C. All right, coders, how did you do? I couldn't see a thing. I cannot see the chat. And on that note, I'm going to ask Miss Tamika to take the screen because I want to see the chat.
No worries, Queen. I got you. So I will take the screen.
Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you, Mrs. J. We appreciate it, Queen. And I tell you, we have had a full feast. I think we're ready to go sit on the couch, right? We've got to let this simmer. So, how did you do? How did you do? If you got it, super. And if you missed something, but you learned something, well, you know that's priceless, right? You guys have been simply outstanding. And let me just leave you with everybody knows Miss Dory, right? That when life gets you down, you know what you got to do. Just keep swimming, swimming, swimming. Or in our case, just keep coding, right? We want you guys to be encouraged. Thank you so much to our part two team. We appreciate you all. And Mrs. J, we have simply just really enjoyed being under your tutelage today. Always a treat, always a joy. I think everybody is full with the virtual feast. I expect everybody to bring a dish on next weekend. We appreciate you guys. We appreciate you coming prepared and for your attentiveness today. And we will see you all very, very soon. Make it a great one, guys.
4,000 exam passers and free classes at AMCI. Learn to code straight from home or on the road at AMCI. We're on the East Coast, the West Coast. We're all around the world. AMCI. AMCI. AMCI.